This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horror, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Sean Eads and Josh Viola about their new collection, Midnight Vintage. Joshua Viola is a Colorado Book Award winner, Splatterpunk nominee, editor, and producer with projects ranging from graphic novels to video games. In 2024, he founded the multimedia company BitBot Media. He is also the owner and chief editor of Hex Publishers. Josh resides in Denver, Colorado with his husband and son. Sean Eads is a writer and librarian living in Denver, Colorado. His works include The Survivors, Lord Byron's Prophecy, Trigger Point, 17 Stitches, The Feast of Panthers, and Confessions. Sean and Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Here's an icebreaker question. Why is the horror genre uniquely suited to multimedia hybrids? Think video games, comics, haunts, festivals, escape rooms.
In my opinion, I think all genre fiction is very much suited for that, and the subgenres that link them all together. But that's because that's my world, right? So my job is to try to connect those dots between all of those things. Might be an interesting take for Sean to jump into that, since you're more of specifically the storyteller, as opposed to me, where I'm like
the brains. I'm the brains of the operation. Is that what you're saying?
Whatever makes you feel better, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, I think horror just hits all of the senses more than any other genre, in my opinion. You can have almost nothing going on in a scene visually. Let's say if you're watching a movie, and just the sound alone is creating the dread. Or you could take a movie like The Exorcist, which really has almost no soundtrack at all, and it's just purely the visual, the makeup. And then when you start combining things like that, it just heightens everything. So, I think more than any other genre, it's very naturally built to, kind of bring in everything that you've got going on. It's the genre that kind of marshals every weapon that a storyteller can possibly have.
I agree, and also I think that horror immediately ups the stakes, heightens the tension, and plays with the expectations and the rules in a way that maybe sci-fi doesn't. Sci-fi has some world building to do to get you in and be like, ooh, that's cool. Like, what if we did have this invention, or what if history was different in such a way? Whereas with horror, anything can happen. If you want to get someone into an escape room or a video game or a haunted house, it's that immediate threat that you're hanging over their head, as opposed to romance or drama that takes a larger cast and more time to develop. I don't know. I don't see a lot of escape rooms built around romance. Maybe there should be. One example I'm sort of pointing towards is the video game / comic book you did around a haunted corn maze.
Yeah. Sean and I co-wrote the comic. Yeah, that's for Terror in the Corn, which is one of the most popular, best-rated haunts in the U.S. That's here in Colorado, where Sean and I are both located, and I partnered with them to do a comic book and a video game with BitBot Media. We launched the game, and Sean and I wrote the first issue of the comic that came out last year, and we're working on the second issue actually right now. Horror is very atmospheric. You can peel the layers and apply it in different mediums and in interesting ways.
Sean, you have a long list of novels under your belt. How is it working in a silo on a single project by yourself and then breaking containment to collaborate on a series of short stories?
Oh, I love the collaboration actually more than my solo stuff in many ways. Writing by its very nature is a kind of a solitary thing. For me, our collaborations have become more than collaborations. They've become chances at bucket list opportunities for things that writers hardly ever get to do. So, we're talking about, writing comic books and graphic novels, writing for video games, potentially writing for a movie or two, or writing for TV shows and things like that.
I've had a few librarians on the show. How much of that career intersects with being a writer? Are you deep in the stacks pulling reference material? Are you guiding other readers into genres you love?
librarianship, public librarianship anyway, and if you're working, say, the floor, working the desk where there's a lot of public interaction, one of the primary things that we do is called Reader's Advisory, where we are trying to connect people with authors, or authors that they like, or authors who we think they might like based on what they tell us, read alikes and things like that. For me, the bigger intersection is people. What I mean by that is you meet a lot of very interesting characters working in a library. You never know who's going to come through the door. I mean, that's probably any job where you're working with the public. A library is unique in that anyone can come in and there's no expectation that you buy something or anything like that. It's a very welcoming, it's a safe place for a lot of people too, people that are unhoused or, going through tough times. And so you have some very interesting interactions and with some sometimes peculiar people, to put it mildly, and it will sometimes feel like, oh, this person is almost auditioning for a role in a story somewhere down the road. I mean, actually, one of my probably third or fourth published stories is taken from a library patron who's since deceased. He came up to me asking for information on poison, like poisons, and I said, okay, well, what can I try to help you find? And he begins to tell me that he is living in a senior center, like an assisted living sort of deal. And he says that the staff are coming in and are taking his food out of his refrigerator while he's not there. So he intended to poison the food to kill them, so that when they stole the food, they would die.
So Sean, instead of alerting the police, wrote a story. Sorry.
Well, first he showed them the Poisoner's Handbook.
Exactly.
Well, I have the well-thumbed copy right here. These are my favorite poisons. These are the hardest to detect.
Yes.
These ones are really agonizing. Long, lingering, slow deaths. Lots of frothing at the mouth.
But yeah, I stowed the memory of that interaction away. And then a few years later, I used that as a basis for a story called His Poisoner. There are any number of ways working as a librarian and working with the public where I have gotten story ideas.
Who wants to read a back-of-the-book summary of your collection, Midnight Vintage?
Go for it, Sean.
It's a collection of 20 stories. 16 of them are reprints from various magazines and anthologies, and 4 are new that we wrote specifically for the anthology. We called it Midnight Vintage in part because we felt like it's opening up a bottle of wine and you don't know exactly what you're going to pour out of this dark bottle of alcohol that is like a Mad Willy Wonka vented it. So you will find horror, you'll find dark science fiction, you'll find a little bit of crime and suspense. You'll find some experimental fantasy in there. So we try to kind of hit everything.
Yeah, it's like I've described it as a mixtape. It's a nice, diverse blend of experiences.
The cover is evocative of like an old EC comic book, and it almost feels like rifling through a stack of old comics and getting just a grab bag of weird tales. I think this is the first collection I have reviewed that has been a collaboration between 2 writers. And what makes that so interesting is that instead of there being one through line, maybe with a couple twists, it feels like there's a strange push-pull, like there's 2 poles that is slightly warping each story and confounding expectations. It was very hard for me to, see where these stories were going. Let's each pick one story to dive deeper into. Who came up with the idea for the short story, The Bidden?
That actually started as a concept that we pitched for Terror in the Corn. We pitched them something and they liked it, but they said it just didn't work within the lore that they had already developed for Terror in the Corn. And so Sean and I sort of took the main concept there and reestablished it and turned it into more of our own unique thing. But yeah, that was our process a lot of the times is, depending on if it's a call for submission for an anthology or we just want to create something, or if we have like a real purpose behind it, like putting a pitch together for Terror in the Corn. Usually what we do is we get together. Late at night. We were talking about doing it tonight, actually, after this, and we go for a walk, typically around my neighborhood, and we usually walk for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and that's where it starts. We just start riffing, and we go back and forth, and that's how I would say the vast majority of the stories start. And certainly, I would think for the Bidden. Sean then took the concept and really, when he first sent it to me, I was like, I misread it and I thought it said the Biden, and I was like, I don't want to do a political story, but anyhow, so that originated as a tearing the corn pitch, and then it evolved into what you see in the book.
Awesome. So more cornfield horror. I'm glad we were able to tie those threads together, but also the image of you guys walking and talking and breaking a story is so present in that sort of handing the tale back and forth and throwing twists and topping each other as it gets weirder and more sinister and more grotesque. I really like this one. Can you give us a log line for the Bidden?
Yeah, imagine if the old fairy tale about the poor cobbler who is being helped by elves, like the elves are making the shoes at night. Imagine if the elves were horrific little creatures who are extremely helpful in all parts of his life, are there to give him help regardless of whether he wants it or not. And the help gets more and more sinister as it goes along.
When they move from the Boston shoe store out into the desolate cornfield, it really gets sinister. It all has this sort of fairy tale, folk tale texture running through it. And at a certain point, you name check John Barleycorn, which I was very excited about. Was that your touch, Sean?
That was my touch. Anything that's even smacks remotely of like literary or class is going to be coming from me.
Should be noted, he's wearing a monocle and a top hat and nothing else, but still, it's classy.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that one. That was a fun one.
It's a fine example of our writing process because our walks might go for a couple of hours. I mean, the entire time we are just kind of hashing ideas out. And then once we land on an idea that we both like, which is usually within about a half hour or so, we will start feeding off of each other's enthusiasm and the energy of like, oh, this could happen, that could happen, that could happen. Honestly, most of the time, by the end of the walk, we have verbally already created a first draft. And then I will usually go home and just do the proper writing of it, getting it all on paper. I think Josh and I would both consider ourselves to be structure guys. In the sense of like really playing around with the formal aspects of storytelling as opposed to, oh, just make it up as you go along and see what happens.
It can be tricky to collaborate on something if you're both flying by the seat of your pants.
That prior communication and the back and forth and the talk that we do in the present with each other is the key, is the magical aspect of it. And I mean, I truly, when I say magical, I truly mean that. It feels like when we're doing it, like this is something unique is happening here between the merging of our creativity, for lack of a better term, and our sensibilities. It might be midnight when I get home and I'm tired. It's like, no, I want to start writing. I'm excited by what we've just, what we've hashed out and what we've come up with. I don't want to wait till the morning. I don't want to wait, at risk of feeling like that energy is just not there.
You got to bottle it, hence Midnight Vintage.
Absolutely.
Josh, do you want to give us a log line for the Jarheads?
That's a complicated one, but it's a fun one. Essentially, there is a group of kids with these special abilities, and they believe that they're being held and contained in this what they believe is a government facility, and they're being watched and looked at, and they're examining these skills that they have, these supernatural skills and abilities. Think X-Men. And there's a huge twist. Not only is it a dark, sinister, messed up story, but it's also got a lot of dark humor, and it makes me laugh, and it's extremely gross. And it's one of the ones that we found a fun way to mesh all of the different subgenres into that one, and it worked out really well, in my opinion.
Sean, you were saying earlier that horror hits all the senses, and I would say this is especially true for the Jarheads. This is a classic 80s style story of psychic warriors. Each of them has some kind of clairvoyance for seeing at a distance, or hearing from a distance, or sensing time at a distance. There's one who has the ability to taste things at a distance, and he is the butt of the joke, but the least likely amongst them might be the one to save them.
Yeah, that was fun. I actually, that makes me want to go back and reread that one. It's been a while.
All right, Sean, will you give us a logline for Diminished Sevenths?
Yeah, so this is a riff on a famous silent German horror movie called The Hands of Orlok. The movie is kind of like the first example, really, of body horror, I think, in cinema. It's certainly one of the earliest examples. A famous pianist ends up getting in a train wreck and causes his hands have to be amputated. This is in the movie. And while that's happening, a notorious murderer is being executed, and a doctor decides to graft the killer's hands onto the pianist, so he doesn't lose the ability to play. Once the pianist learns where his hands came from, he starts feeling the compulsion to kill. And the question becomes, is this a psychological thing, or are the hands actually really controlling him in some way? We took that premise and had a lot of fun, sort of like rewriting it and reinvestigating it from a different point of view. And it was written specifically for an anthology that Crystal Lake Publishing put out that was aimed at a reimagining and retelling of classic movie monsters and villains, like from those 20s and 30s, the silent era and the early MGM era.
That was Classic Monsters Unleashed that
Yeah.
James Accolone edited. We wanted to approach that because we knew there was going to be, Dracula stories and all of, literally the classic monsters. And I think that The Hands of Orlok is 1922. But we both thought that would be a really neat starting point to kind of write this quote unquote like sequel, spiritual sequel in it.
So I'm not surprised that original story is from the 20s. I mean, it's a big high concept idea. It's a classic trope of body transplant from a murderer, but where you guys took it was so far afield from that starting point. The way you grounded it in the historical time period, it turned out much creepier than its inspiration.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Definitely for that, because I really enjoy writing historical fiction, and particularly anything set from about 1850 to about 1930 is kind of my bread and butter, really. I love the 19th century, the Victorian era, and up through, kind of like the Edwardian, early Georgian era. That's just, I read a lot of history about that. I watch a lot of documentaries about that. And, particularly to have a chance to write something in kind of like old Vienna. It's set right after World War I, where everything is just sort of in decay, and you have an entire generation of people that are feeling lost. And the idea of like hand reading and palmistry plays an early is a part of that. And I love the the sort of the paranormal aspect of that was sweeping through Europe right after World War I, much like it swept through the United States after the Civil War. When you have so much trauma and so much loss, people become a lot more interested in the idea of seances and I'm trying to reconnect with my dead person, my dead relative that died in the war. I feel completely disconnected because of what has happened, this great social upheaval. And so people looking for any means to sort of divine what path they should take. And of course, the people that are frauds that come and play into that was something that I wanted to capture in that story as part of a plot point that gets the whole thing moving. Any time that I can set a story in kind of a historical period like that, I will go for it. And it just makes it unique. And there's a certain tone that you can adapt as a narrator that's a little bit more formal that I like that tone a lot as a storyteller. Also, because, when you have a setting that gets rid of the technological conveniences of the modern day, which for storytelling to me are technological inconveniences, because as you're thinking of the plot of a modern day thing, you might say, well, why wouldn't they just use their cell phones and call the police? Whatever. So it'd be like, if you think Stephen King, like Cujo. Now, if that was said in the modern day, it's like, well, that wouldn't happen, because they wouldn't be trapped in the car. They'd just use their phones and call the police. Unless, you've got to work in some sort of thing like, well, they're in a remote area and they can't get a signal, or so you have to come up with an excuse, or their phone has died. I find historical settings like what you find in what we've done here to be very freeing and liberating, in terms of like, all right, I don't have to worry about that aspect. I can just tell the story.
I was just working on a project that's sort of a kids on bikes throwback, and I was like, God, I wish they had phones. How are they going to get this information to each other? How are they going to know?
Walkie-talkies, man. Walkie-talkies.
Oh, sure. If the threat is pedestrian, like a dog outside your car, then yeah, you want to reach for that phone. But if the threat is supernatural or systemic, calling the police might be the last thing you want to do, because the police might be a horrible complication, or they might not believe you, or they might come and take you away, or maybe the police are in on it. So I do like stuff that manages to be of the moment, but still isolate characters, maybe because of their social status or their situation, or if something's going on that no one would believe them, or maybe these people aren't entirely clean and innocent and they can't just call the police when they have a problem because they've got a warrant out on them or something. So it doesn't matter if you woke up and saw someone sitting at the end of your bed. You're not going to call the cops for that. I mean, you could, but can you tell us a little bit about the cover art for Midnight Vintage?
Yeah, so the art is by Skinner. I was a big fan of his work. He's got a pretty substantial following, but he has a very unique look. As Sean, described, I think he's very spot on. Yeah, it looks like something, you'd see those black light posters and Spencers from the 90s, right? Like that's very much what Skinner does. But yeah, I was a fan of his, and I ended up producing one of his movies, which is coming out soon. It's a stop motion film that Phil Tippett, if I'm pronouncing it right, he's the legend, stop motion legend from a vast array of films, probably Jurassic Park being the most famous, even though his work really wasn't seen on screen. He did Mad God, which came out recently. Anyhow, I had Skinner do some covers for a few different projects, including Midnight Vintage, and I just purely from a fan of his work, I wanted his work to be on one of my covers, and he was cool enough to do it. I thought he did a fantastic job, and we have seen a great response to that, so he killed it.
Now it's time for a Halloween treat. Can you each recommend a book, movie, game, food, or experience, past or present, that puts you in the Halloween mood?
For me, I'm a big Halloween fanatic. I've got jack-o'-lanterns tattooed on my forearm. I love October. It's a horror movie every night, but for me to kickstart that season, it's always Pumpkinhead, the original.
You'll fail, Ed Harley. You'll fail and you'll die.
Nice. Sean, how about you?
Movie-wise, it's a movie Josh introduced me to a couple of years ago, actually, and I've seen it 4 or 5 times now. It's Trick or Treat. I absolutely love that movie. In fact, I think it's almost perfect in the way it designs its little vignettes.
All these traditions, jack-o'-lanterns, putting on costumes, handing out treats, they were started to protect us, but nowadays, no one really cares.
There's a chain called Alamo Drafthouse. This past October, they showed Trick or Treat a couple of times, and I caught it in the theater every single time. I love it so much.
Yeah, I think that movie would pair very well with Midnight Vintage. My Halloween treat for this episode is the score for Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In October, I was going through a little bit of Halloween doldrums. Spooky season officially kicks off like July 5th, going pretty hard in September, doing a lot of creative work, planning for Halloween, things like that. And at some point, there's like an ebb, sometimes early, mid-October. I was in my car and I just pulled up the score by Wojciech Kilar, the infamous score to Bram Stoker's Dracula. And ooh, that just put me right back in the pocket.
Yeah, no, that really, with the violin and the cellos that are in that it's just incredible. You're right. It's one of the great soundtracks. It is a perfect mood setter. It's just beautiful.
For side projects, just because I think my listeners might be interested, can you guys speak a little bit on True Believers?
True Believers is my comic book series that I wrote with Stephen Graham Jones. 2 issues are out currently. The 3rd one will be out this year. We're working through when to launch that because they're all Kickstarter related. It'll probably be this fall. And it's very much a meta horror comedy that examines toxic fandom and cosplay. And it explores our fictional Michael Myers of this universe, which is called Killer, and how some fans take their fandom too far. It takes place at the Real Colorado Festival of Horror, which I sponsor every year. And we always do something special every year for True Believers. And it also features official cameos by people such as Jamie Lee Curtis, R.L. Stein, cast of Deathgasm, Guar, Matt Heafy of Trivium, Slash, Jeff Combs, Barbara Crampton. A fun side project for Stephen and I, who is a good friend of mine. He wrote the foreword, Midnight Vintage, and we both love comics and horror, and he lives like 20 minutes from me, so it's a good excuse to get together and hang out.
Sean, where can our listeners find you online?
The simplest thing is my website, which is SeanEadsWriter.com.
Josh, where can our listeners find you online?
Best place to find the projects I'm working on is bitbotmedia.com. All of our socials are there.
Well, guys, thank you for hanging out, and thanks for telling us about Midnight Vintage.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow. We're now on YouTube. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular. Well, Sean, as you know, there's no statute of limitations on murder or being an accomplice to murder. And I'm sorry, this is not a podcast. This is a sting operation. Guys, we got him.